The ghost of the eldest son. A curse returns. In a once prosperous family estate, tragedy strikes when their only son, Nathan, mysteriously dies under chilling circumstances. During the funeral, whispers of his troubled past fill the air, but an unsettling truth begins to unfold. As the grieving mother, Margaret, spirals into despair, eerie occurrences plague the household, ominous knocking in the dead of night, an apparition at the window, and Margaret's anguish cries to her deceased son. The father, Charles, skeptical but desperate, turns to a shrouded figure, a sinister medium, who proposes a horrifying ritual to restore their heir. As the night descends, the boundary between life and death collapses, leading to a harrowing confrontation that forces the family to confront their sins and the wrath of the restless dead. Part 1. The funeral. The sun had barely risen, but the bustling courtyard of the Wilkins estate teemed with grim activity. Black-clad servants moved briskly, their hands trembling slightly as they arranged tables, poured water, and adjusted funeral decorations. The thick, heavy air was soaked with the scent of wilting flowers. No one dared pause, as though stillness itself would summon the dead. The grand estate, once a beacon of prosperity and laughter, had turned to shadow. A black canopy loomed over the yard, its draped fabric rippling like dark waves in the soft morning breeze. The mourners huddled at round tables, their whispered conversations punctuated by nervous glances. Every word seemed to hover around one name, Nathan. "It's too sudden," said a man, his voice trembling. He hunched over, cradling a cup of tea and shaking hands. "I spoke to the boy just days ago. Full of life, full of dreams. And now, this." "Did you hear how it happened?" murmured another. A woman with sharp eyes who spoke in hushed but urgent tones. Her gaze flickered toward the house, as though expecting something unnatural to appear in the doorway. "Strange," someone muttered from another table, shaking his head. "They say it happened at night, no illness, no accident. He just stopped breathing." "Stop breathing," the woman scoffed. "Does anyone stop breathing just like that? Something doesn't sit right." The wind shifted, sending a low moan through the trees. A collective shiver passed over the crowd, and conversations dwindled to silence. From the house, the faint, guttural sound of sobbing carried on the breeze. Margaret. Inside, Margaret Wilkins sat alone in the center of the grand hall. Once a room filled with sunlight, it now lay cloaked in shadow. Thick velvet curtains swallowed the light, plunging the room into murky darkness. Only the glow of flickering candles illuminated her figure, a silhouette of grief. Her face, pale and gaunt, seemed carved from marble. Margaret's black dress fell in waves around her, its fabric crumpled under her trembling hands. She clutched a delicate silver locket, Nathan's locket, and stared ahead, unblinking. Memories clawed at her mind. The knocking, it had been sharp, violent, a pounding so furious it rattled the door hinges. At first, Margaret had thought it was the wind, but when she opened her bedroom door, the knocking stopped and the silence rang louder than any sound. She had stood there for what felt like hours, her pulse pounding like thunder in her ears. Then she had seen it, the faint outline of someone in the hallway. Nathan. Her lips quivered as tears welled up in her eyes. It couldn't have been him, but she had seen his figure, standing there, staring back. The realization clawed at her, a jagged truth she couldn't escape. Her boy, her beautiful boy. The heavy wooden doors creaked open, snapping Margaret from her reverie. Charles entered, his face pale and drawn. His once proud frame seemed smaller now, as though grief had shrunk him. "Margaret," he said, his voice rough, but she didn't look up. "They've seen him," Charles whispered, almost afraid of his own words. Margaret's head jerked up, her hollow eyes locked onto him. "What did you say?" Charles hesitated. "The servants, some of the mourners too. They swear they've seen Nathan." Margaret's face crumpled. Her lips trembled as she whispered, where Charles looked toward the window, standing there, just staring in, like he's watching us. Margaret's breath hitched. Her hand, still clutching the locket, began to tremble violently. She pushed herself to her feet, her chair scraping across the floor with an ear-splitting screech. The sudden sound echoed through the hall, startling Charles. Margaret, wait, she didn't. Her feet carried her swiftly across the room, the black hem of her dress dragging behind her like a shadow. She burst through the doorway and into the cold air outside. The mourners turned as one, their murmurs silenced as Margaret emerged. Her wild eyes scanned the courtyard, darting over every window, every shadow searching. Her chest rose and fell in shallow gasps, desperation etched into her every movement. "Nathan," she cried, her voice cracking with grief. "Nathan, where are you?" Nothing answered her but the wind. A chill swept through the crowd, and uneasy glances were exchanged. An old man muttered a prayer under his breath. Charles appeared in the doorway, his face tight with both fear and frustration. "Margaret," he hissed, his voice barely audible. "Stop this." She turned to face him, her face streaked with tears. "You heard them," she whispered hoarsely. "They saw him. Our son. He's here." "Charles, I know he is." Charles' jaw clenched, his gaze flickering to the mourning guests who now stood in stiff, uncomfortable silence. He crossed the yard, gripping Margaret's arms tightly. "Nathan is gone," he said firmly, though his voice faltered. "You need to let him go." Margaret shook her head violently. No, I won't. He's here. I can feel it." A long silence stretched between them. Finally, Charles sighed, his shoulders sagging in defeat. "Come back inside. Please." Margaret didn't move. Her eyes lingered on the house, on the window of Nathan's room. For just a moment, she thought she saw something shift in the darkness. A faint outline, a shadow. Her heart leapt. "Nathan," she whispered again, but when she blinked, it was gone. The wind moaned low, like a voice whispering from beyond the grave. Margaret shivered and let Charles pull her back toward the house. The guests watched them go, their faces pale and strained. No one spoke of what they had seen or what they thought they had seen, but unease hung over the estate like a storm cloud. From the shadows of the window above, a faint tapping sound echoed in the air. Thud, thud, thud. No one noticed. But Nathan was watching. Part 2. Margaret's despair. The grand hall was shrouded in gloom, its former grandeur suffocated by the heavy velvet curtains that blocked out the light. Flickering candles threw faint, trembling shadows across the cavernous room. Margaret Wilkins sat in a high-backed chair, her frail figure dwarfed by the dark expanse around her. She seemed more ghost than living woman, her skin pale as frost, her mourning dress pooling around her like liquid midnight. Clutched tightly in her trembling hands was Nathan's silver locket. It was small, delicate, and worn with age, the final keepsake of a boy whose laughter once filled this house. Her hollow eyes stared blankly ahead, as if seeing something no one else could or dared to see. Knock. 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 The sound lived in her mind now, repeating with every beat of her shattered heart. That dreadful pounding. It had come from the front door 3 nights ago, so loud it had shaken the walls. Margaret had lain in bed, frozen, as it echoed again and again, relentless as a drum at a funeral march. When she had finally gathered the courage to descend the grand staircase and open the door, the night had greeted her with a howling wind, and nothing else. But she knew. Something had been there, watching. "Nathan!" A sudden noise broke the silence. The great doors creaked open, and Charles stepped inside, his face as pale as hers. His shoulders sagged under the weight of grief, his once steady hands now shaking at his sides. He hesitated, as though unsure of how to approach his wife. "Margaret," he said softly, his voice hoarse. She did not look up. "Margaret," he repeated, more urgently. Finally, her hollow gaze lifted to meet his. "They've seen him," Charles whispered, his voice nearly breaking. "The servants. The mourners. They swear they've seen Nathan." Margaret's face twitched, her lips parting as though she couldn't quite form the words. "What did you say?" she breathed. Charles swallowed hard. At the window, he gestured toward the second floor. "They said he's standing there, just watching. Like he's waiting." The locket slipped from Margaret's hands and clattered onto the floor. She shot to her feet, the chair screeching against the wood as it tipped over behind her. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her eyes wild. "Nathan!" "Margaret!" "Wait!" Charles called, but she was already moving, her black dress sweeping behind her like a shadow. She tore through the house with frantic desperation, her bare feet slapping against the cold stone floors. Her heart raced as she climbed the winding staircase to Nathan's room, her knuckles white as she gripped the railing. The house seemed alive around her, groaning, whispering, waiting. Margaret pushed open the door to Nathan's bedroom, and the hinges wailed like a dying thing. The room was untouched, frozen in time. His toys sat neatly on the shelves, his bed still made, the scent of his favorite lavender soap lingering faintly in the air. Her eyes darted to the window. For a moment, just a flicker, she saw it. A shadow. A boy's silhouette, standing just beyond the glass. Nathan. Margaret screamed, rushing forward. Her hand slapped against the icy pane, her breath fogging up the glass. But the figure was gone, swallowed by the darkness. He was here, she whispered, her voice trembling. He was here. From behind her, Charles's voice came, low and strained. Margaret. There's no one there. Margaret turned sharply, tears streaming down her face. Don't you see it? Don't you feel it? He's here, Charles. He's trying to come back to us. Charles stared at her, his expression hollow and hopeless. Nathan is gone, he said quietly. We have to accept it. No, Margaret shrieked, her voice echoing off the walls. She sank to her knees in front of the window, clutching at her chest as sobs racked her body. No, he's not gone. I know he's not gone. Charles knelt beside her, placing a tentative hand on her shoulder. Please, Margaret, come back downstairs. This isn't healthy. You're scaring yourself. She didn't move, her gaze still fixed on the glass. What if he's trapped? She whispered. What if he needs us to bring him back? Charles closed his eyes, pained. Margaret, please. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence. Knock. Knock. It came from the window. Margaret gasped, her head snapping toward it. Charles froze, his face drained of all color. Knock. Knock. It's him, Margaret whispered, her voice reverent, her tears forgotten. She scrambled to her feet, pressing her hands against the glass. Nathan? Nathan? Is that you? Charles pulled her back roughly. Stop it, Margaret. There's nothing there, but Margaret's eyes widened in terror as she pointed to the foggy glass. There, etched into the mist, were 3 words written by an unseen hand. Let me in. Charles staggered back, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Margaret's hands flew to her lips as a sob escaped her throat. Let me in. The room seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The candles on the dresser flickered violently before extinguishing themselves in unison. Cold seeped into the walls, biting at their skin. Nathan, Margaret whispered, trembling. This isn't Nathan, Charles said, his voice breaking. He grabbed Margaret's arm and pulled her toward the door. We need to leave. Now. But Margaret resisted, her tear-streaked face wild with desperation. He's calling for us. Charles, don't you see? He's calling for us. Bang. The window rattled violently, as if something had hurled itself against it. The room erupted into chaos. The books fell from the shelves. The bed creaked as though something unseen sat upon it, and the air itself seemed to hum with anger. Charles dragged Margaret through the doorway, slamming it shut behind them. The banging on the window grew louder, echoing through the halls. As they stumbled down the staircase, Margaret screamed, Nathan. I am here. But Charles only tightened his grip, his face twisted in terror. That is not our son, he said through gritted teeth. The house moaned and groaned around them, as though the very walls were alive. Outside, the wind howled like a mournful cry, carrying with it a sound that froze Margaret's blood. A child's voice, faint and distant. Mother, let me in. And somewhere from the 2nd floor, the knocking began again. Knock, knock, knock. Part 3. The first night. Night fell like a shroud over the Wilkins estate, smothering the grounds in darkness. A cold wind clawed at the shutters, rattling them like bones, and the once proud house groaned against the weight of its secrets. Inside, Margaret lay rigid in her bed, her eyes wide open, fixed on the ceiling above. The room felt heavy, suffocating, as though the very air had grown thick with an invisible weight. Shadows stretched unnaturally long along the walls, twisting and curling like creeping fingers. Margaret's breath came shallow, each exhale visible in the frigid air. The fire in the hearth had long since dwindled to a faint, flickering ember, and an unnatural silence pressed in on all sides. Then it came. Thud. Thud. Thud, a sharp knocking sound, deliberate and heavy, reverberated through the house. Margaret bolted upright, her heart hammering in her chest. Sweat glistened on her brow as she strained to listen. Thud. 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 It was louder now. Closer, a sound that seemed to resonate not just in the walls but in her very bones. She threw back the covers, her hands shaking as she slid her feet onto the icy wooden floor. "Nathan," she whispered, her voice trembling, caught somewhere between longing and terror. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, pressing against her ears like a scream just out of reach. Margaret's pulse pounded as she glanced toward the window. It was closed, but a draft brushed her cheeks cold and damp, like breath on her skin. She swallowed hard, the knot of fear in her throat growing tighter. Slowly, as though guided by an unseen force, Margaret rose to her feet. Her nightgown billowed softly around her legs as she shuffled toward the window. Her breaths came shallow, fogging up the glass as she drew closer. Her hand trembled as she reached for the curtain. She pulled it back, and there he stood, Nathan. Outside the window, silhouetted against the moonlight, was the pale face of her son. He was motionless, his hollow, dirt-streaked eyes staring directly into hers. His expression was blank, but his presence was overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Margaret's body froze, the air catching in her lungs. For a heartbeat, neither mother nor son moved. Then Nathan's lips parted, ever so slightly, as though he were trying to say something. But no words came. Margaret pressed a hand to the window, her fingers splaying against the cold glass. "Nathan," she whispered, tears blurring her vision. "My boy, you're here. You came back." Nathan didn't move. The longer she stared, the more his face seemed to change. The hollow blackness in his eyes deepened, and the dirt on his skin spread like veins, dark and unnatural. His mouth moved again, but no sound escaped, only the faint impression of a plea. Margaret's tears spilled over. "What do you need, my love? Tell me. Please." Thud. The sound exploded against the glass as Nathan's hand struck the window. His pale fingers splayed wide. Margaret stumbled backward with a gasp, her heart lurching. The knocking began again, harder and faster. Thud. 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 The window pane rattled violently in its frame, and the glass groaned under the pressure. Margaret's scream tore through the silence, but it was swallowed by the sound of the pounding. She spun around, clutching her chest, only to see the bedroom door slam shut with a deafening bang. "Charles," she screamed, her voice raw. "Help me. Someone help me." The pounding stopped. For a moment, there was nothing, only the faint crackling of the dying fire. Then Margaret heard it. A whisper. "Mother," she froze, her body trembling. The voice was faint but unmistakable, Nathan's voice. It drifted from the window, a fragile thread of sound carried on the wind. "Mother, let me in." Margaret turned slowly. Her blood ran cold. Etched into the frost on the window were 3 words, written in a child's uneven hand. "Let me in." Margaret stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her as she crumpled to the floor. She clutched the locket at her throat, her breaths coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't real," she whispered to herself, rocking back and forth. "It can't be real." A sudden scraping sound tore through the room, and Margaret's head snapped toward the door. The knob twisted slowly, rattling as though someone or something was trying to get inside. "No," she whimpered, crawling backward. "No. No." The door creaked open inch by inch, until the gap was wide enough to reveal the darkness beyond. A figure stepped into the room. It was small, child-sized. It stood still, its head bowed so Margaret couldn't see its face. "Nathan," she choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure raised its head. It was Nathan, but not the Nathan she knew. His skin was pale and sunken, his eyes black pits that seemed to pull in the light. His lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile as he took a step forward. "Mother!" Margaret screamed. She scrambled to her feet, throwing herself against the window as though she could tear through the glass. Behind her, Nathan moved closer, his bare feet dragging across the floor. The candles in the room blew out, plunging everything into shadow. Margaret twisted around, her back pressed against the freezing window. She could hear him now, his slow, ragged breathing filling the room. She clutched her locket, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she sobbed. "Please, Nathan. Stop the boy," or whatever it was stopped. For a moment, the room fell still and Margaret dared to hope. Then Nathan's mouth opened, wider than any human mouth could stretch. A low, guttural sound poured out, a sound that made the very walls tremble. Margaret screamed again as the shadows around her began to ripple and move, closing in like a tide. The window behind her shattered. An icy wind blasted into the room. Margaret stumbled backward, her screams fading into the howling night. The last thing she saw was Nathan's face, grinning as he disappeared into the darkness. When Charles found the room the next morning, the window was broken, and frost had crept across the walls like veins. The only trace of Margaret was her silver locket, lying cold and still on the empty floor. From outside, faint and distant, the knocking began again. Thud. Thud. Part 4. A sinister proposal. The hours crawled by in a haze of shock and grief, and when dawn arrived, Margaret's screams had long since been replaced by hollow silence. She sat in the corner of the drawing room, her face streaked with tears, her hands clutched tightly around Nathan's locket. The once opulent room was dark now, its heavy curtains drawn shut as though to hide the house from the waking world. Charles stood nearby, pacing back and forth. His face was pale, his eyes sunken with sleeplessness and fear. The events of the night haunted him, but he refused to speak of them, refused to admit what they both knew. The whispers, the knocking, the shadow in Nathan's room. "It wasn't him," Charles muttered, breaking the silence. "Whatever you saw, Margaret." "It wasn't Nathan." Margaret flinched at the words. "It was him," she said hoarsely. "He needs us, Charles. He's calling for us, begging for us to help him." Charles spun to face her, his voice sharp. "Margaret, our son is dead. Do you hear me? Dead." Margaret's shoulders sagged, her face contorting in pain. "I won't believe it. I can't believe it." Her voice trembled as she looked up at her husband, her eyes hollow and desperate. "You saw it too, didn't you? That was Nathan. He's here, trapped in this house. In that room." Charles said nothing. He turned away, his hands shaking as he ran them through his hair. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and unbearable. And then came a voice. "Perhaps there is a way." Both Margaret and Charles froze. The voice seemed to slither into the room, dark and smoky, as though it came from nowhere and everywhere all at once. Charles turned sharply, his face pale as he stared at the man who now stood in the doorway. The stranger was gaunt, his frame wrapped in a long black cloak that swept the floor. A hood obscured most of his face, but what little could be seen was unnerving thin lips curled into a faint smile and eyes that gleamed like polished coal. Margaret rose to her feet, her voice wavering. "Who are you?" The stranger stepped forward, his movements fluid and soundless, like a shadow come to life. "A friend," he said softly. His voice was unnervingly calm, smooth as silk but with a weight that made the room seem colder. "A guide for those who find themselves at the edge of despair. And those willing to reach beyond it." "Get out of my house," Charles snapped, his voice trembling with rage. "You're not welcome here." The stranger ignored him and turned his attention to Margaret. "You," he murmured, pointing a pale, bony finger. "You have seen the boy. You have heard his call." Margaret's lips parted, but no sound came out. The stranger took another step closer. "You want him back, don't you? To see your son smile again, to hear his voice. You can bring him back." Margaret gasped softly, clutching the locket at her throat. "What do you mean?" How Charles grabbed her arm. "Margaret, no. Don't listen to him." "Silence," the stranger said, his voice low but commanding. Charles staggered back as though an invisible force had shoved him. The stranger turned to Margaret again, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "To restore life," he said, his voice slithering like smoke. "One must disturb death." Margaret frowned, her brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" The stranger smiled faintly. his teeth gleaming white against the shadows. The boy's grave must be opened. His body must be brought back to this house. Charles' face twisted in horror. "You're mad," he spat. Mad. The stranger's voice deepened, growing darker, colder. The air in the room seemed to chill, as though the fire itself had gone out. Or desperate. "Tell me, Charles Wilkins, would you let your name vanish into oblivion with him? Would you let your legacy crumble to dust?" Charles recoiled, his hands balling into fists. "I will not desecrate my son's grave. I will not." The stranger ignored him, his gaze never leaving Margaret. He tilted his head slightly, his voice soft again. "Your boy calls to you, Margaret. You can hear him, can't you? You know what I say is true. He is waiting, trapped between this world and the next." Margaret's eyes brimmed with tears. Her breath hitched as the stranger's words sank deep into her heart. "Bring him back," the man whispered. "Open the grave and his soul can return." It is the only way. Charles grabbed Margaret's arm again, his grip bruising. "Don't you dare. Margaret, don't you dare listen to him." Margaret turned to her husband, her tear-streaked face set in determination. "You heard him, Charles. Nathan is trapped. He's suffering. How can we leave him like that?" Charles shook his head violently. "It's not him, Margaret. Whatever you saw last night, that was not our son." "You don't know that," Margaret shouted, pulling her arm free. "You didn't see him the way I did. You didn't hear his voice. He needs us, Charles." The stranger watched the exchange silently, his faint smile never wavering. "Margaret," Charles said, his voice breaking. "Please, don't do this." Margaret turned back to the stranger, ignoring her husband's pleas. "What do I need to do?" she whispered. The stranger's smile widened. "Go to the grave tonight. Bring the boy's body home. When he rests beneath this roof again, his soul will return." Charles's voice rose to a shout. "Margaret, no!" But Margaret had already made her choice. Her hands clenched the locket tightly, her gaze steady. "If there's even the smallest chance to bring him back, I have to try." The stranger turned, his cloak sweeping the ground as he moved toward the door. "Tonight," he said, his voice lingering like a shadow. At midnight. With that, he disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a silence that seemed deeper and colder than before. Charles sank into a chair, his face buried in his hands. "You'll doom us all," he whispered, his voice broken. Margaret said nothing. She stood motionless, staring into the fire, her mind already set. Outside, the wind howled, carrying with it the faintest whisper, a child's voice drifting through the night. "Mother." Part 5. The graveyard. The graveyard was a cold abyss, a realm untouched by warmth or life. Fog coiled around the tombstones like ghostly serpents, swirling beneath the gnarled branches of ancient trees that loomed overhead, their skeletal limbs clawing at the night sky. Margaret and Charles moved slowly, lanterns in hand, their silhouettes distorted by the flickering light. Every breath they took was visible in the icy air, shallow and quick, as if the very ground they tread resisted their presence. "We shouldn't be here," Charles muttered, his voice hoarse and trembling. His knuckles were white as he gripped the handle of the shovel slung over his shoulder. "Margaret." "This is madness." Margaret didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed ahead, unwavering, her face pale as marble in the lantern's glow. The tear tracks that streaked her cheeks had dried, leaving only the hollowness in her eyes, a deep, haunted emptiness that Charles could barely stand to look at. She clutched Nathan's locket tightly to her chest, her lips moving in silent prayer as they approached the burial plot. Nathan's grave lay at the farthest edge of the cemetery, where the land sloped into a hollow fringed by thick trees. The ground here was damp and uneven, as though it had not settled since the burial. The gravestone itself was simple, marked only with Nathan's name and the date of his death, a date that now seemed to mock them both. Margaret stopped a few paces from the grave, her lantern trembling in her hand. Charles set his own lantern down, the light pooling at their feet like a faint, golden aura. He turned to face her, his expression drawn and desperate. "Margaret, please," he said, his voice raw. "We can't do this. You know this isn't right. Let him rest. For God's sake, let him rest." Margaret's gaze flickered to him. but her face remained stony, unreadable. "He's not at rest," she whispered, each word sharp and deliberate. "I hear him, Charles. I hear him calling for me." Charles swallowed hard, his throat dry. The lantern light flickered, casting strange shadows across the ground, as though the earth itself was shifting beneath them. He gripped the shovel tighter and shook his head. "It's not him," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "It can't be." Margaret ignored him. Without another word, she stepped forward and knelt beside the grave. Her fingers traced Nathan's name on the headstone, lingering on each letter as her breath hitched. "My boy." "I'm here," she whispered. The wind seemed to respond, swirling around them in a sudden, icy gust that made the lantern flames dance violently. Margaret turned to Charles, her voice firm. "Dig." Charles froze. "What I said, dig," she repeated, her voice louder now, cracking with desperation. "If you won't help me, I'll do it myself." Charles's heart sank as he watched her reach for the second shovel lying in the grass. Her hands were trembling, but her resolve was unshakable. "Margaret, stop," he shouted, grabbing her wrist before she could begin. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you'll find." "I know exactly what I'll find," Margaret shot back, her voice rising with a manic edge. "I'll find my son, and I'll bring him home." Charles faltered, his grip loosening as he stared into her eyes. They were wild now, consumed by grief and something else, something darker. With a sigh of defeat, he picked up the shovel and stepped toward the grave. "God forgive us," he murmured as he drove the blade into the damp earth. The first shovelful of dirt landed with a dull thud. Charles flinched, as though the sound reverberated inside him. He dug slowly at first, hesitantly, but with each movement of the shovel, the tempo increased, his motions growing desperate and frantic. The ground was heavy and unyielding, as though it knew what they were doing and fought back. Margaret stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly around the locket. Her lips moved in silent whispers, prayers mixing with pleas. "Nathan, I'm coming, my love. I'm bringing you home." The night pressed closer. The graveyard seemed to grow darker, the lanterns barely holding back the encroaching shadows. The wind moaned through the trees, a sound that grew more shrill, more anguished, with every shovelful of earth removed. Charles's breathing turned ragged, his muscles burning with effort, but he didn't stop. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. Charles froze, his eyes wide as he glanced up at Margaret. Her face was ghostly pale, her gaze fixed on the open grave. Slowly, Charles dropped to his knees and began clearing the remaining dirt with his hands. The wooden lid of the coffin emerged, slick with moisture and stained with earth. A terrible stillness blanketed the graveyard. Charles hesitated, his fingers resting on the coffin lid. "Margaret, open it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Charles shook his head. "This is wrong." "We open it," Margaret screamed, her voice echoing through the graveyard like a gunshot. Charles's hands trembled as he slipped his fingers under the edges of the lid. The wood groaned in protest as he pried it open, the sound splitting the silence like a scream. A foul, damp air rushed out, carrying with it the scent of earth, and something worse, something old and rotten. Charles recoiled, gagging, but Margaret fell to her knees beside the coffin, clutching the edge. "Nathan," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, my boy." The coffin was dark inside, the shadows thick and cloying. But then, something moved. Margaret gasped as a pale hand, small and delicate, rose slowly from the depths of the coffin. "Charles," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He's alive. He's alive." Charles stumbled backward, his face ashen. "Margaret, no. Get away from it." But Margaret didn't hear him. She reached for the hand, her fingers brushing against its icy skin. The moment they touched, Nathan's face appeared in the coffin, pale, hollow, his eyes black as endless pits. His lips curled into a slow, unnatural smile. "Mother," he rasped, his voice twisted and broken. Margaret screamed, but it was too late. Nathan's other hand shot up, grabbing her wrist with inhuman strength. The lanterns around them flickered wildly, the shadows writhing as the wind erupted into a deafening howl. Charles lunged forward, grabbing Margaret's shoulders and pulling her back. "Let go." "Let her go," he shouted. Nathan's grip remained firm, his smile stretching wider, unnatural and grotesque. His voice, now echoing with otherworldly power, whispered through the chaos. "You brought me back. Now you must stay." The ground beneath the coffin trembled, as though the earth itself had woken up. Margaret shrieked, thrashing in Charles's grip as Nathan's pull grew stronger. With a final desperate heave, Charles tore Margaret free. They stumbled backward, falling to the ground as the coffin slammed shut with a thunderous bang. The wind stopped. The lantern sputtered out, plunging the graveyard into total darkness. Part 6. The Awakening. The coffin creaked and groaned, the sound splitting through the thick silence of the graveyard. Charles stumbled backward, the lantern in his hand shaking violently as its dim light flickered across the horrific scene. Margaret, still kneeling by the grave, froze. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her trembling fingers clutching the edge of the coffin as if to anchor herself to reality. Nathan moved. At first it was subtle, a twitch of his fingers, a shift of his shoulders. But then, the unnatural sound of joints cracking echoed in the night air. Nathan's body sat up, the coffin groaning under his weight, its wood creaking as if in protest. The pale glow of the lanterns lit his face, a face that should have been at peace, but was now something far from human. Margaret's voice trembled, barely a whisper. Nathan slowly, his head turned. Nathan's eyes shot open, wide and blazing with an unearthly fire, not the soft, innocent gaze of her son, but two black abysses alive with flickering red light. His lips, cracked and bloodless, curled into a twisted, unnatural smile that stretched far too wide. "Mother," he rasped. The words slithered from his throat like the scraping of rusted metal. A voice that belonged to something much older, much darker than a boy of 20. The sound sent an icy shiver down Charles's spine, freezing him in place. Margaret screamed, a sound so raw it seemed to tear from her soul. "Nathan," she gasped, tears streaming down her face. "It's me. I'm here," my love. Nathan's head tilted sharply, like a marionette pulled by invisible strings. The fire in his eyes flared brighter as he regarded his mother. His mouth opened again, a hoarse whisper echoing unnaturally through the still graveyard. "You called for me." Charles lunged forward, grabbing Margaret by the shoulders and yanking her away from the coffin. "Margaret, no, that's not Nathan, let me go," Margaret shrieked, clawing at Charles's hands. "He's alive. He needs me." Nathan's head snapped in Charles's direction, his smile disappearing. Slowly, his gaunt body began to rise, his movements jerky and unnatural, as though he were fighting the very laws of nature. The coffin rattled beneath him, and the wind picked up again, whirling leaves and dust into the air like 1,000 whispering voices. "You took me away," Father Nathan rasped, his hollow gaze drilling into Charles. His voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, low and reverberating. "Now I will take you." Charles staggered back, his face ashen. "Stay away from me," he choked out. But Nathan stepped over the edge of the coffin, his bare feet sinking into the damp earth. Every step he took was slow and deliberate, the lantern light casting his figure in shifting, monstrous shadows. Margaret twisted free from Charles's grip, her sobs desperate and broken. "Nathan, please," she cried, stumbling toward him. "It's me, your mother. We brought you back, my darling boy." Nathan paused, his body swaying slightly, his face softened for the briefest of moments, the fire in his eyes dimming. Margaret reached for him, her voice trembling with hope. "My boy, my beautiful boy." Suddenly, Nathan's mouth split open, wider than any human jaw could stretch. From his throat came a sound so terrible it seemed to shake the earth, a deep, guttural wail, laced with screams and sobs, as though countless voices were crying out from within him. Margaret froze, her expression turning to terror as Nathan lunged. His hands shot out, fingers clawing, grasping her wrists with inhuman strength. "You called for me," Nathan roared, his voice a cacophony of shrieking souls. Charles sprang forward, slamming into Margaret and knocking her to the ground, just as Nathan's hand swiped through the air where she had been. Charles pulled her up roughly, half dragging her backward as Nathan's gaze followed them. burning through the darkness. "You cannot leave me," Nathan hissed, his voice dropping back to that bone-chilling whisper. He took another step, the earth beneath him darkening, as if rotting under his weight. "Margaret, run!" Charles shouted, his voice hoarse with panic. Margaret, sobbing and shaking, allowed Charles to pull her away. The graveyard seemed alive now, the ground trembling, the wind howling through the trees. The lantern light faltered, casting wild shadows as they ran, stumbling over roots and uneven ground. Behind him, Nathan's voice followed, echoing louder and louder, his words twisting into an anguished wail. "You cannot leave me. Mother. Father. You brought me back." Charles and Margaret reached the cemetery gates, throwing them open with a loud clang. Charles glanced back just once and saw Nathan standing at the edge of the graveyard. The boy, if he could even be called that anymore, was barely visible now, cloaked in shadows. Only his eyes remained, blazing like twin torches in the darkness. The wind screamed through the cemetery, slamming the gates shut behind them. Inside the house, Margaret sat by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, her hands still trembling violently. Charles stood near the window, staring out into the night with haunted eyes. The graveyard loomed in the distance, cloaked in fog and darkness. "We should never have done it," Charles whispered, more to himself than to her. "We should never have disturbed him." Margaret said nothing. She stared blankly into the flames, her tears long since dried. In her hand, she clutched Nathan's locket so tightly her knuckles had gone white. The fire crackled, filling the silence, but it offered no warmth. Then it came again. A faint sound, soft, deliberate, carried through the house. It was distant at first, but grew louder with every heartbeat. Thud. 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 Charles turned sharply, his face pale. No, Margaret's eyes widened, her lips parting as the sound repeated itself, closer now. Thud. 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 From the direction of the front door. The knocking continued, steady and deliberate, reverberating through the floorboards like a heartbeat. Margaret rose to her feet, her face frozen in horror. "Nathan," she whispered. Charles grabbed her arm. "Don't you dare!" But Margaret didn't listen. She moved as if in a trance, her footsteps slow and heavy as she walked toward the front door. Charles called out to her, his voice shaking, but she ignored him. The knocking grew louder. Thud. 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 Margaret's trembling hand reached for the latch. Charles ran toward her, shouting, but it was too late. The door swung open. For a moment there was nothing, only darkness beyond the threshold. Then, out of the void, Nathan stepped forward. His eyes burned like fire, his smile stretched impossibly wide. "Mother," he whispered. The lanterns in the house blew out, and the screaming began again. Part 7. The Confrontation. Nathan's twisted silhouette stood in the doorway, his blazing eyes casting unnatural light into the room. The air turned icy, so cold it stole the breath from Margaret's lungs. Her trembling hand slipped from the latch, falling limp at her side as she stared at her son. "Or what was left of him, Nathan," she whispered, her voice no louder than a breath. The thing that had once been Nathan stepped into the house, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet with broken strings. The wooden floor groaned under its weight, though its bare feet made no sound. Charles stumbled back, shielding Margaret with his arm, terror twisting his features. "Stay back," Charles bellowed, his voice cracking. "Whatever you are, stay back." Nathan tilted his head, a sickening creak sounding from his neck as he did so. His eyes, those fiery, inhuman eyes, fixed on his father. Slowly, impossibly, his lips stretched into that same grotesque smile. "You brought me back," Nathan rasped, his voice layered with others' countless whispers, screams and sobs echoing from within him. "Now you will join me." Margaret stumbled forward, tears spilling from her wide, hollow eyes. "Nathan, no, no, my boy, it's me, your mother. Please, it's me." Nathan's gaze flickered to her, the red fire in his eyes dimming just slightly. For a heartbeat, something almost familiar appeared on his face, a shadow of the boy he had been. Margaret reached out toward him, desperation choking her voice. "Come back to me," she whispered. "Nathan, please." I brought you back because I love you. Because I couldn't bear to lose you." Nathan blinked. The fire flickered. His pale hands twitched at his sides. For a moment, Charles dared to hope. But then Nathan's face contorted, his mouth twisting into a snarl that seemed to split his skin. The red fire roared back to life, brighter than before. And with a scream that shattered the air, his arm shot forward. His fingers closed around Margaret's wrist. The moment they touched, the house seemed to breathe, the walls trembled. The air erupted into an icy gale, and a low, guttural hum filled the space, vibrating through the floorboards. "Margaret," Charles shouted, lunging for her. Nathan's grip tightened, and Margaret let out a strangled cry as her knees buckled. The firelight flickered wildly, illuminating the horror etched into her face as she stared into her son's blazing eyes. "You wanted me back," Nathan growled, his voice deep and fractured, a cacophony of anguish. "Now you will stay with me." The ground trembled. Dust rained from the ceiling as the house groaned under the force of the wind. The lanterns exploded, glass shattering and plunging the room into darkness. Only the red glow of Nathan's eyes remained, burning like two coals in the abyss. Charles grabbed a broken chair leg from the floor and swung it with all his strength. "Let her go," he roared. The wood struck Nathan square in the chest, but he didn't flinch. Instead, he turned his head toward Charles, his mouth curling into something resembling amusement. "Father," Nathan said softly, though the word dripped with menace, "did you think you could save her?" Charles froze as Nathan released Margaret's wrist. Her limp body collapsed to the floor, and Charles fell to his knees beside her, shaking her shoulders. "Margaret, Margaret," wake up!" Her eyes fluttered open, wide with terror. "Charles, he's not our son," she croaked, her voice hoarse. Nathan's form loomed over them, his shoulders hunched unnaturally, his limbs twitching like they were barely contained. He took a step forward, and with each movement, the ground beneath him blackened, as though rotting beneath his feet. "You will not leave me," he said, his voice echoing in every corner of the room. "You brought me here, and now you belong to me." Charles staggered to his feet, dragging Margaret up with him. "We have to get out of here," he panted, his voice shaking. "Come on." Margaret clung to him, her legs weak beneath her, but she stumbled alongside him as Charles led her toward the back door. The wind howled, slamming doors and windows open and shut, the sound of wailing voices rising with it. "You cannot run," Nathan's voice thundered, as though the house itself was speaking. The hallway stretched impossibly long as Charles and Margaret ran, their footsteps echoing louder and louder. The doors they passed seemed to warp and twist, shapes pressing against the wood from the other side, clawing, scratching, whispering. Charles threw his weight against the back door, but it wouldn't budge. He rammed his shoulder into it again and again, panic clawing at him. "No, no, come on." Open from behind them, Nathan approached, his steps slow and deliberate, though his presence seemed to consume everything around him. The walls cracked, splintering as dark veins spread like poison through the wood. Margaret turned, her voice ragged. "Nathan, stop!" The boy halted, his blazing eyes fixed on her. For the briefest of moments, the wind died down, and the house fell eerily silent. Nathan tilted his head, his mouth curling into a cruel smile. "Mother," he whispered softly. Margaret's lips trembled. "You don't have to do this. Please. Let us go. Let me help you." Nathan's smile faltered. The fire in his eyes flickered again, and for a moment, the lines of his face softened, his features becoming the boy she remembered. Margaret took a step toward him, her hand reaching out slowly. "Nathan, my love," she whispered. But just as her fingers brushed his cheek, the fire roared back to life. Nathan let out a shriek of rage, his body twisting violently. "You abandoned me," he screamed, his voice shaking the very foundation of the house. "Now you will never leave." Charles grabbed Margaret's arm, yanking her back just as the floor beneath Nathan splintered, erupting into darkness. The boy's figure sank into the gaping chasm, his screams echoing in a chorus of tormented voices. "You will stay," Nathan wailed, his burning eyes the last thing to vanish into the void before the floor slammed shut. With a deafening crack, the house fell still. The wind ceased, and the wailing voices faded, leaving only silence in their wake. Charles collapsed to his knees, Margaret clinging to him, her sobs shaking her frail body. The house stood quiet once more, but something lingered in the air, a heaviness, a presence that had not fully gone. Charles looked at Margaret, his face ashen. "Is it over?" he whispered. Margaret's hollow eyes turned toward the now quiet doorway. The faintest echo of a knock, soft and deliberate, reverberated through the house. Thud. Thud. Thud, she shuddered, clutching the locket at her throat. "No," she whispered. "It will never be over." Part 8. The aftermath. When the morning sun rose, its golden rays spilled across the Wilkins estate, illuminating a house that had fallen eerily silent. The once grand mansion, now cloaked in shadow and decay, seemed almost to shrink under the light, as though hiding from the day. A thin mist still lingered over the graveyard behind the house, curling around the headstones like the last remnants of a nightmare. The servants, who had huddled in fear through the endless night, were the first to flee. At the break of dawn, they rushed from the house in a frantic exodus, their faces pale, their eyes wide and haunted. None spoke of what they had seen or heard, none dared. The whispers, the wailing, the furious wind that had torn through the halls, it was too much for any of them to bear. One by one, they disappeared down the overgrown path leading from the estate, their hurried footsteps swallowed by the silence. Inside, the house was empty, or so it seemed. Charles sat slumped in the grand hall, his back pressed against the wall, his face hollow and pale. The events of the night had etched themselves into his very bones. He clutched his knees to his chest, rocking slightly, as though the movement could dispel the horror that lingered in his mind. His hands were raw and scraped, dirt still clinging to his nails, a grim reminder of what they had done. "Margaret," he croaked, his voice a cracked whisper. There was no answer. His head turned slowly toward the far side of the room, where Margaret sat in a chair by the cold, dead fireplace. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, her expression vacant. In her lap lay Nathan's locket, its silver chain wrapped tightly around her trembling fingers. She had not moved or spoken since the moment they had escaped the graveyard, since the chasm had swallowed their son's twisted form. "Margaret," Charles said again, his voice breaking. He reached a trembling hand toward her. At last her head lifted. She turned to him, but her gaze passed right through him, empty and distant. "He's still here," she whispered. Charles's chest tightened. "No," he muttered, shaking his head violently. "No, Margaret. It's over. It's done. He's gone, he's here," she repeated, her voice hollow. "I can feel him, watching, waiting." Charles pushed himself unsteadily to his feet, his body aching with exhaustion. "You need rest, Margaret." "We both do," his voice wavered as he approached her, his hands shaking. "Come, let me help you upstairs." Margaret didn't move. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the locket tighter. "He's not gone," she whispered again, a tear slipping down her cheek. Charles stopped, his blood running cold. He turned toward the doorway leading to the graveyard. A sliver of sunlight cut through the gloom, but it seemed to offer no comfort. His gaze dropped to the floor, where dirt-streaked footprints led from the open door to the center of the hall, footprints far too small to be his or Margaret's. His breath hitched. No, a sudden knock reverberated through the house. Thud. Thud. Charles's heart stopped. Margaret flinched, her eyes snapping up toward the front door. For a long moment, neither of them moved, their bodies paralyzed by fear. Then it came again. Thud. 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 Charles turned to Margaret, his face ashen. "Did you hear that?" She nodded slowly, her lips trembling. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, rattling the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling as though the house itself were shivering. "He's come back," Margaret whispered, rising slowly to her feet. Her movements were sluggish, as though pulled by invisible strings. Charles rushed to her, grabbing her shoulders. "No, Margaret, don't. It's not him. It's not Nathan." But Margaret didn't seem to hear him. She moved toward the door, her steps deliberate and slow. Charles followed her, his mind screaming in panic, his pulse racing. "Margaret, please. Don't open it." She reached the door. The knocking stopped. For a long moment, there was only silence. Charles lunged, grabbing her hand before it could reach the latch. "Stop," he roared. "Don't you dare." Margaret froze, her chest heaving as she stared at him. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I just want to see my boy again, Charles." Just once more, the door shuddered violently, as though something was pounding on it with inhuman strength. The sound echoed through the house, a dreadful rhythm that made the very walls tremble. Thud. 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 "It's not Nathan," Charles shouted, his voice breaking. "He's gone, Margaret. He's gone." The door burst open. A freezing wind howled into the house, extinguishing the last of the fire's embers and plunging the room into icy darkness. Margaret screamed, clutching the locket as the wind whipped through her hair. Charles staggered back, shielding his face as a shadow stepped across the threshold. It was small, childlike, and familiar. "Nathan," Margaret gasped, her voice trembling with disbelief. The shadow tilted its head, the faint outline of a smile visible in the darkness. But its eyes, those burning, fiery eyes, were the only light in the room. It stepped forward, and the floor creaked beneath its weight. "You wanted me back," it said, its voice a terrible chorus of whispers. Margaret fell to her knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "I'm sorry," she cried. "I'm so sorry." My boy. Charles grabbed her, dragging her back as the shadow advanced. "Leave us alone," he roared into the dark, his voice hoarse with terror. "You don't belong here." The shadow paused, its blazing eyes fixed on Charles. The whispers grew louder, swirling around the room like a storm. "You brought me back. Now you must stay." With a final scream of defiance, Charles lunged for the door, grabbing Margaret and pulling her with him. They stumbled into the yard, collapsing onto the damp grass as the wind roared behind them. The door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the morning air like a gunshot. For a moment, all was still. The house stood quiet, its windows dark and empty. The mist began to lift, and the sun rose higher, its light chasing away the shadows. Charles pulled Margaret close, her sobs muffled against his chest as they stared at the house, a house that now stood desolate and hollow. In the graveyard beyond, Nathan's grave was open, the earth piled in an unnatural ring around the empty coffin. The house had given him back, but the price had been paid. The servants never returned to the Wilkins estate, and no new family ever moved in. Locals whispered of strange sounds that carried on the wind, a child's laughter, a knock at the door, a faint voice calling for its mother. The house stood abandoned, its halls forever haunted by the horrors of that night. And deep within the walls, the echoes remained. Thud. Thud. Part 9. The knocking. The Wilkins estate stood abandoned, its once grand facade now crumbling under years of neglect. Ivy crept up its walls, and the windows, now coated in grime, stared blankly like hollow eyes. Though the sun occasionally touched the mansion during the day, it did nothing to dispel the lingering sense of dread that hung over the grounds. The villagers avoided the estate, their superstitions whispered from one generation to the next. But at night, when the mist rolled in and cloaked the graveyard, those whispers grew louder. "They say you can still hear it," an old man muttered one evening at the local tavern, his gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of ale. "Hear what?" a boy asked, his curiosity laced with unease. The old man leaned forward, his voice lowering to a conspiratorial whisper. "The knocking," he said, his eyes flicking toward the window as though expecting to see something beyond the glass. "It comes from the Wilkins estate. Always just after midnight. Clear as a bell." "Knockin'," another man scoffed, though his laughter faltered. "Don't be daft. It's an old house. The wood creaks. The wind knocks shutters loose." The old man shook his head slowly. No, it's not the wind. It's a sound that rattles your bones. Thud. Thud. Thud, like someone pounding on the walls, the doors, or the windows." The boy's face went pale. Who would knock in an empty house? The old man's expression darkened. "Not who, boy. What?" The villagers swore they could still hear it, the knocking. It came at the same time every night, just beyond the windows of the Wilkins estate. A steady, deliberate rhythm that rang out across the grounds, audible even to those brave enough to venture near the estate's edge. Few dared to test their courage, but stories still spread. A pair of teenage boys had crept onto the estate one night, armed with lanterns and bravado. They claimed they would prove the tales were nonsense, a prank fueled by generations of fearful minds. "What are we even looking for?" one of them asked, his voice trembling slightly as they crossed the overgrown path toward the house. The mist, thick and icy, clung to their clothes as though trying to drag them back. "Proof," the other boy replied, though he didn't sound so sure anymore. "It's just an old house." Everyone's scared of shadows. They reached the front steps, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows across the rotted wood. The door loomed ahead of them, slightly ajar, as though waiting. "You hear that?" the first boy whispered, freezing in place. The second boy frowned. "Hear what?" Then it came, faint but unmistakable. Thud. Thud. Both boys spun toward the sound, their lanterns swinging wildly. "It's just the wind," the second boy insisted, though his voice cracked. "The windows are probably rattling," but it came again, louder this time. Thud. Thud. Thud, a sound that vibrated through the ground and echoed into their chests. It wasn't coming from the doors or the walls. It was coming from the window. The boys turned in unison, their lanterns illuminating the nearest pane of glass. For a long moment, nothing moved. The window stared back at them like a dark, glassy void. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a shadow passed behind the glass, a small, childlike shape. Both boys screamed, their lanterns dropping as they turned and ran. They tore through the mist, their frantic cries echoing through the trees. By the time they stumbled back into the village, they were pale and shaking, their clothes torn and their voices broken. "He was there," one of them stammered. "The boy. The one from the stories. He was there watching us." He smiled. He smiled. No one doubted them after that. Years passed, but the Wilkins estate remained untouched. The mansion sank deeper into decay, its windows shattered, its doors hanging from their hinges. The graveyard beyond it was swallowed by weeds, Nathan's gravestone still cracked and split where it had been disturbed. And yet, the knocking never stopped. Some nights, villagers swore they could hear the sound even from their own homes, miles away. Thud. 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 It traveled on the wind, through the trees, always faint but clear enough to send chills down spines. A farmer walking his fields late one evening claimed he saw lights flickering in the mansion's windows like lanterns moving from room to room. "Someone's inside," he told his neighbors, his voice a hushed whisper. "I saw him. A boy, standing in the upstairs window, just staring. Another man, a hunter passing near the estate at midnight, returned home pale and trembling. I heard it," he said. "The knocking. It followed me through the woods. I swear it was close enough to touch." The story spread like wildfire, yet no one dared enter the house to uncover the truth. Those who ventured too close always came back changed, if they came back at all. One cold autumn evening, as the mist settled thickly over the village, a small group of travelers passed through town. Unfamiliar with the legends, they scoffed at the warnings of the locals. Ghosts? Knocking at windows, one of them laughed over dinner at the inn. "It's nonsense. Old stories meant to scare children." The innkeeper said nothing but glanced toward the window nervously, as though expecting to see something standing just beyond the glass. That night, the travelers decided to explore the Wilkins estate for themselves. They never returned. Villagers found their horses still tied outside the inn the next morning, but of the travelers, there was no sign. A search party was sent to the estate, their lanterns barely cutting through the dense fog. The house stood silent, as it always did, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though watching. In the upstairs window, the villagers saw it. A small figure. It stood perfectly still, its face shadowed, but its presence was unmistakable. The figure turned slowly, as though it had seen them, and one by one, the search party fled, abandoning their lanterns in the grass. That night, the knocking echoed louder than ever. Thud. Thud. It traveled through the village, waking sleepers, freezing blood. Parents clutched their children tightly, whispering prayers to ward off the sound. But still it came, rhythmic, endless, impossible to ignore. And as the sun rose over the hollow, barren estate, the villagers swore they could see him, a small boy standing in the window of the Wilkins house, his black eyes burning like embers. The knocking never ceased. Thud, thud, thud.